We will start today's session with a presentation of the concept of participatory strategy, where we're going to look at 3 questions. What is participatory strategy? Are you ready to try it? And finally, how can you try it? We'll then move to some individual reflections and discussion in breakout groups, and we'll conclude with headline takeaways back together as one group. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the chat box. We might not have time to address them today, but they will certainly be very useful for planning a part 2 call on participatory strategy. More about it later. And now on to our speakers, a little bit about them. So our speakers today are Sati Houston and Tanveer Hasan. Sati is a nonprofit and for-profit strategy consultant who helped us plan and design this call. And most recently, Sati was the lead strategist for Wikimedia Foundation's grantmaking, which supports grantees in over 80 countries. Just to note that Wikimedia is the nonprofit behind Wikipedia. And Tanveer is a senior program officer at Wikimedia Foundation. Most recently, he was part of the core team designing and shepherding Wikimedia's 2030 movement strategy, which is a globally open and participatory process that engaged hundreds of volunteers, staff, institutions, partners, and subject matter experts to collectively create a roadmap to 2030. And now I give the floor to you, Sati and Tanveer.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zoya. So hi, everyone. So glad to meet you virtually, wherever you are in the world, morning, evening, or night. Thank you for joining today on this topic of participatory strategy, which I think is, for many of us, a new term in a large ecosystem of frameworks and discussions around strategy. So what is participatory strategy? I think it's a few things. First of all, just a new term for an existing conversation around power and agency. I think it evokes the tension between, for instance, structure and agency, where, and being greatly reductive here, structure is the systems that kind of guide or constrain or sometimes predetermine our choices, and agency is our inherent freedom to choose and to act. I think it's another chapter in an ongoing epic around power, how power over and power with shows up in our institution and systems. And by virtue of being focused on power, participatory strategies really inherently focus on equity, on returning agency to the people most affected by current institutional systems and actions, and also those who have been affected by historical systems of oppression. It brings attention specifically, though, to structural power and how to shift it. I like Mickey Cashton's description of structural power, where it allows us, by virtue of access to resources, by virtue of making decisions around the systems that others participate in, structural power gives us the possibility of limiting other people's access to resources, to narrow their options, to make choices on their behalf. And I think in some ways, even unintentionally, sometimes blinds us from the consequences of those actions and decisions. Lastly, participatory strategy is a response to what I'm calling so-called traditional strategy. Now, obviously, there are many frameworks and many different approaches to strategy. Each organization often creates its own particular flavor of that. But I think in a lot of strategy, especially that mirrors some of the for-profit elements of strategy, there are elements that are predicated on power over assumptions, on a certain level of hierarchy and unilateral decision-making. What's interesting here, though, is I've used the word power a lot so far, and I've often been struck in these kinds of conversations that we often don't talk about what power is. We only talk about how it's used. And I think that's an oversight. That's something in our later breakout groups we're going to talk about. I think that's the starting place, actually, before we open Pandora's box on how to change a strategy process. I want to call out, though, that participatory strategy is not a few things. And these are often, now, there's a lot of fears, I think, around adopting or shifting a strategy process, especially if you've had a particular approach for many years. But I want to call out that just like traditional strategy is not singularly defined by any one framework or approach, so is participatory strategy not defined that way. It is always contextualized, always adapted, to your particular definition of who are your communities, how do you engage them, what level of, what issue area you might be working on. Are you working with governments? Are you working with other institutions? Are you working with private citizens or corporations, etc.? It's a constellation of who is your community, and therefore that really affects what your particular strategy process might look like. Also, one of the big assumptions I've always heard around any kind of participatory anything is this fear that it becomes around forcing consensus. And I think I just want to call it very explicitly that this kind of approach to strategy is not about forcing consensus. Even with two people, right? It's never the case that everyone participates in all decisions. Even if people can have opinions about everything, we don't necessarily want or need them to form opinions about everything. The key really here is how to make it possible for people to participate in the things that actually interest them and they have motivation and expertise in, and then to accept the decisions about other issues that other people make. Lastly, it is not only about engaging more people. It's not just about increasing the breadth or the quantity of people who engage or give input into your process. I think that, again, so-called traditional strategy processes already have a lot of avenues for increasing the ways that people can provide input and where they can provide input in the process. So the differentiating factor for me around this traditional or participatory approach lies in one aspect around how decision-making power is shared and with whom. And we'll talk more in depth about that a little later. So after all of this, I hope there are some of you still interested in pursuing this different kind of strategy process. In the next section, we're going to talk about readiness, meaning what questions do you need to answer before you make the decision to change your strategy process. I bring this up because often what I've seen is that the answers to these questions are assumed. And then later on in the process, the lack of alignment around these answers actually becomes a stumbling block. It becomes a place where the process kind of gets stuck and then has to kind of reset or diverge suddenly and then come back, detour, and then come back later on to continue. So the first two questions, in terms of determining readiness, focus on the why. Why are you considering changing your process? This is so important given there are many externalities, pressures, and just plain old inertia that's going to try and push you back to what was done before. It could be a push for expediency, for a push for results, a push for just starting already, or even the push to prioritize the point of view or the ideas of someone who has typically had a lot of power. The why becomes an anchor point to return to remind you of why these growing pains of change are worth it. But it also becomes the underlying foundation for keeping yourself accountable, for maintaining the legitimacy of this process in the eyes of your communities. As Tanveer will talk about, volunteer time, motivation, and expertise are one of the most precious resources. It's a thing that can't be replicated. But there are so many examples of institutions who have promised to share power and then haven't. With marginalized or historically excluded communities, there can be a potent underlying skepticism, especially if this is your first participatory anything. So these accountability systems become critical and need to seek to continually answer two questions. One, why are people going to trust us? Why are they going to trust this change, especially on such a gnarly topic as power? And secondly, perhaps more importantly, if they give us this trust, how can we ensure that we continually remain worthy of that? The second two questions, though the last two questions, are around power sharing and motivation. And for this, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Tanveer to talk about more in depth.
Thank you, Sati. My father, always a wise gentleman, had mentioned that you should never be the second person to speak after an excellent person has opened the conversations. So I think this is this is just to say how wise my father is. I mean, Sati said a lot of amazing things. What I wanted to talk about is, at the outset, power sharing looks like a very radical thought but it's not all that glamorous. And I don't say this because there is no big takeaway from power sharing. It's also because power sharing happens at many different levels, and we usually tend to talk about strategy and power sharing at the highest level, which is these large gestures, these institutional decisions of saying that you're expanding the board or you're bringing in many different people to talk about these discussions. While it's an important component of power sharing, there are some very key, some very important things that go into the heart of sharing of power. Let's take, for example, the usual compositions of board. When you typically get into a participatory mode, when you expand the board, you're also bringing in people who do not have prior experience with power. Sharing of power is pretty easy because one already has it. But for somebody to interact with power, for somebody to become accustomed and acclimatized with power and then contribute is always tricky. And usually in processes that come with either a stipulated date or with a outcome at the end of it, the way that power interacts is that this is an opportunity and this is the outcome. This is an opportunity or this is a responsibility and this is supposed to be the result. The correlation between the power that is shared and the output that is expected is not in the favor of people who just enter into the conversation. It is always in the favor of people who are not just situated in power, but also people who are comfortable in power. I think that's a key question to talk about participatory strategy. One other thing that I would want to talk about in our conversations around power is that power sharing happens at many different levels and at many different points in that process. Like decision making is about power. Legitimacy of that particular decision is of power. How does power influence these processes is both at the broad strokes of this is how the process is going to be, and we have made a decision, sometimes very well thought out, sometimes those are insightful, incisive, and extremely intuitive decisions. They all have a life of their own, but there is a hidden way in which power operates, which is that the decisions that come to you are not up for discussion. The process that comes to you is up for discussion. So is that a balance? Is that what we are looking at? Participatory strategy is another key component that organizations will have to put in. I think moving the same conversation into a slightly different into a different phase is to talk about motivation. Like Sati mentioned, and I 100% agree, that with all the good intentions of sharing of power, with all of the good ideas around bringing people to become comfortable with power and exercising of it who have previously not done, if you are not able to retain a high quotient of motivation, I think most of the participatory strategies will fall apart. I don't want to sound like I'm the doomsday scenario expert here, but in the process that we ran ourselves within the Wikimedia Foundation, this was something that was our biggest learning. While we did a radically open process, we engaged a lot of people. We engaged Wikimedians, we engaged people from outside organizations, we engaged affiliates, we engaged staff members within the Wikimedia ecosystem. One thing which was very clear was that motivation need to be supplemented. It was not the same motivation that we started with. And this is to be expected, right? It's not like you start and then you keep your motivation high all of the time. But there is a difference here that I want to call out. There's a particular difference between the way we talk about reflexive strategy and reflexivity in the process. Reflexive strategy is something, or reflection in strategy is something where you're talking about outcomes that can be reflected upon, that can be revised, that can be understood and critically analyzed. But when you are reflecting on your own process, when there is reflexivity built in the process, it brings up the question of where is this process going and who is driving this process? Because it is a very important conversation to have, that when you're talking about reflexivity within the process, you're also talking about the health of the process. Motivation is one of the key contributor or key indicator of how healthy is your process from the point of beginning and probably to the point of whatever critical insights, whatever critical course correction that you want to take. when all the processes begin, and I'm saying this because I believe that every single participant here wants to build a process that's true to their communities, that's true to their values. And I would want to believe that all of us will think of a process, imagine a process that has the highest mode of engagement or high levels of engagement and probably a very little component of endurance. But if you look at the way a process develops over a period of time, the engagement quotient comes down drastically and the endurance quotient goes up. Is this something that is inherent to participatory processes? It looks like that because the processes that we build around participatory strategy usually tend to think that by ensuring people's contribution to be at the same level, we are moving certain, or we are certainly moving towards the outcome that we are promising. But that might not be the case. How do I validate this? Again, going back to the strategy process that we did, when we started the process, our first round of conversations were around 150 to 200 people. This was our minimum core conversations, or this was the size of our conversations. By the time the process started to come to a close and it started to taper down, we were left with only a handful of people who were still engaged with us. And just to remind myself and to put it right there in the center, most of these conversations also were sustained because of the high trust factor and high social aptitude and social relevance that we had with some of the participants. Had it not been for the social trust that we had cultivated, probably the process would have broken down. So why should a process be dependent on individual social trust? And why shouldn't it actually imbibe values of motivation and reflexivity built towards the process to ensure the health of the process? I would just want to speak to 2 points before I hand it over to Sati again. The first one, there are certain easy assumptions that we make when we talk about the participatory strategy. The first one being that the length of the strategy process would also ensure longevity of the outcome. That is not true. It does not matter whether you run a 3 years process or whether you run, I don't know, a 6 months process. There are going to be critical points where the outcome of the process will have to speak to the aspirations of the community. If it is not speaking to the aspirations of the community, and if the community has actually grown or has new aspirations, it means that your community is doing a better job of thinking how you are engaging with the larger goals and larger values than the organized part is. And it's a good sign. So let's not confuse the length of the process to the longevity of the process. The second assumption, or not even the assumption, the second point that I want to put forward is that participatory strategy should not be your go-to option if you are trying to resolve a crisis. I think participatory strategy comes to ensure that what you're doing is to steer away from known crisis, because you have so many people, you have so much of wisdom, you have so much of knowledge, and it also ensures that you will stay away from waiting to happen crisis, again with the same reasons. The last point that I wanted to mention and then just hand it over is that while we all want to believe that participatory strategy is a term that already has equity built into it, it is not. I think we should recognize that. What it is that it is a big first step. It's definitely a big first step compared to having a strategy drawn up in a boardroom or handing it over to a consultancy agency. But participatory strategy is also a responsibility. It is a responsibility at the level of the organizer. It's also a responsibility at the level of the participants in it. But the participants come to it with hope and aspirations. The organizer should go into participatory strategy with focus, with a high degree of motivation, and with a high intent and a very high intent of sharing of power and ensuring that participatory strategy is there for the community that you are working with. Thank you very much for listening. I think I spoke a lot, and I'll hand it back to Sati. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanveer. I really resonated with a lot of those points that you brought up. I was just kind of nodding along the whole time. Up until this point, we've talked about the topic of power sharing and participation at a high level, but it is a spectrum. And that spectrum is comprised of what role your communities play within the process, the level of their participation, and the level of power actually put into their hands. I think the entry point for many people is where your communities are a bystander to your process. This is in many ways the most traditional form of strategies. Your communities, our constituents, are informed after the fact, and they have very little recourse to change things. The most common next step, though, is where your communities become a contributor to their process, where they provide input, perhaps in the early parts when defining the problem, and sometimes also in the later stages when reviewing solutions. This can take the form of elaborate consultations, surveys, focus groups, one-on-one interviews, for instance. It essentially is a swelling of ideas that are coming into the central organization. While the shift from that first to the second model might feel immense, though, to you at the center, it's actually, for those at the margins, this is a pretty marginal change in terms of shifting structural power. There is an increase definitely in participation and also an influence, but no real power changes hands. It's only when you get into these last two models that I think you start to see that. When your communities become the recommender, what that means is that they're not just participants. They're actually actively shaping each part of the process to ensure that it's not just that their ideas are going to be present, it's that the right questions are going to be asked, the right analysis is going to be done, that the synthesis of that analysis and then the formation of those end recommendations actually reflects their intrinsic insight into the problem, reflects their lived experiences, and as Tanveer was saying, their evolved aspirations. As much as this does shift some form of power, it also implies a very big ask on your various communities in terms of participation and engagement. And that request for a high degree of participation can in some ways become a structural barrier to participation. Because as Tanveer was saying, those with the ability to participate are often those with the socioeconomic privilege to do so. And so the key question here is not necessarily how do you build a process with all these different elements, how do you create, how do you invite people and create avenues for access, but it's really how do you actually unlock their participation in larger ways than just the process itself to create real inclusion. The last phase is where personally I see communities becoming the center. Now there's a lot of communication and verbiage right now around centering communities, but I think what that means to me is that decision-making power is actually 100% in their hands. Now, up until now, we've been talking about the realm of strategy, obviously because the topic is on participatory strategy. But at this point in this spectrum, I think we start to leave the realm of strategy and really start to edge into the realm of governance, because there's a question that often will come up once you open this Pandora's box of shifting structural power, which is how does that shift actually persist beyond the strategy process itself? And at that point, you're looking at structures and governance. And how do you change perhaps previously centralized structures into more distributed or decentralized structures? And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So these 4 questions that Tanveer and I have talked about altogether create a set of pre-work that I would encourage you to discuss with your teams, departments, or organizations. And even if you don't choose to change your process right now, I think reflecting on them is that beginning of the journey. It's the opening of Pandora's box around the subject of power, and bringing that conversation to light is worthwhile in and of itself. It's a critical pre-step, though, to ensuring that once you make that decision, there's a level of intentionality in the shift that you're trying to make. So let's say you are ready to make this change. What would that entail? The first 2 design considerations, I would say, for adapting your process have to do with first setting your baseline, right? What has been your historical strategic process? Now, I have worked in many different contexts, large Fortune 500 corporations, small businesses, large nonprofits, small nonprofits. And in every single one, each strategy process is kind of its own beast. Did you hire an outside consultant? Was it done internally by a strategy team? Who was on the board at that time? Who was in executive leadership, et cetera? So it's not to say that there is one strategy process you've been using, but there's probably a common thread in certain elements. And those threads create expectations for what will happen in the future. And that's really what you're trying to hone in on. And from that baseline, going back to our spectrum of participation and power sharing, from that baseline, you're trying to see where on that spectrum do you want to be? What level of change can you manage? And how does that manifest in your process design? Now, just to take a step back here, as I was saying, there are so many frameworks on strategy. There's books and books and HBR articles and Medium posts and everything will tell you different approaches to strategy. At a high level, I see strategy as a process of divergence and convergence, where divergence is about gaining insight into the problem. It's about uncovering assumptions and biases, reconnecting with needs, tapping into larger trends and similar movements. At its heart, divergence, that part of the process is about learning. That's really where you're opening yourself up. That's trying to create choice. And then secondarily, it's a process of convergence, where you're trying to define focus, make trade-offs, determine prioritization. At its heart, convergence is around making decisions. It's around making choices. It's when we intersect this high-level view of strategy with that spectrum around participation and power sharing that we start to see what the process actually looks like. In the next few slides, there's a lot of information which I have written out mostly for you all to go back and look at afterward, so that you can kind of see what a strategy process might look at depending on what option you choose in that spectrum. I'm not going to cover all of this because you will have your handout at the end, so I'm only going to focus on the key points. So remember, I think just a little bit a while ago when I said that the bystander or the contributor models were quite similar. I think that's reflected in the processes as well. Things are mostly done within the organization. Decisions are mostly made by the organization's formal authorities. The difference is early on, that in the contributor model, community input is solicited. And later on, perhaps through a similar consultation or more typically through select community review, people are asked to give commentary again. Although I will say that in each part of this process, what I have seen is that, especially coming from the North American or Western Europe version of volunteerism, there is an assumption that this is all being done for free. And I do think that's a big issue, especially because much of that expertise and much of that time and energy that's put into this is no small lift and needs to be recognized. While the move here from the bystander model to the contributor model, if that's where you are, I think it's a good first step. I just want to say that outright. I would encourage you to still try and do it. But I wouldn't call it participatory strategy because of the lack of power sharing. There's a risk really for being called out, for being said like, well, you're not really getting to the heart of what this new kind of approach to strategy is trying to do. It's when you get into these last two models that I think you start to see power sharing become the priority, because this is where the processes really start to diverge from what we typically see. And the processes look different because when the communities take ownership of the process, they're going to reform in new ways. You might have working groups, you might have representative bodies, you might have committees. There's going to be, as Tanveer said, levels of community organizing and diversity in how those groups look and operate. And that's perfect because not only are those structures best fit for the group, but you're actually going to be leveraging the power of diversity and therefore leveraging actually the power of your larger constellation of partners. The big difference between the way your communities are a recommender versus the center is obviously that where decision making sits, but it's also, as I was saying before, the structures, those new reformed ways of community governance, those might actually persist past the strategy process itself, or they might reform again into some new form of governance. This is where you're seeing like federated kind of a centralized body become a federated body, for instance. And these are the kinds of processes that I would call participatory because of both the level of engagement and also the level of power sharing. To round it out, I just want to, we've talked a lot about, what participatory strategy is. We've talked about, different questions for you to consider, but I just want to end here on implications because I do see there are a few things to realize that follow on to the shift in your strategy process. Since most of you are funders, right, I think there's a natural follow-up question or first implication that if you're going to change your strategy process, well, what about your grant making, right? I think it's important if you do shift to a participatory strategy process that you continue that accountability on within your grant making. Beyond grant making, though, it's important to recognize that this shift will change your culture in some ways. For instance, this kind of process necessitates a certain level of civil discourse. It's necessary for robust outcomes. So if that's not part of your culture already, it definitely will be after the fact. Also, what accountability looks like is going to change. That's because during the process, you can't make your communities accountable to the very system that they are trying to create. That kind of creates tension and confusion. So new systems of accountability are going to be built. One of the last big implications, though, is around time. To be forthright, participatory strategies take more time. They take more resources, they definitely take more discussion. But even though they take longer in the short term, they actually, I have seen, save time in the long run. Because you exit the process with far more alignment and buy-in by all the actors in your system. And that means during the implementation of this strategy, you don't have to rehash the same conversations trying to convince people to do the thing that's been set out to do. This last one on time saving was initially very hard for me to see. I think especially coming in it, I originally came from a for-profit context where there was a push for strategy to kind of be done so we could just get going. I think there's a push for, right, like that pressure for short-term results. But over the course of my career, I've been at places where there have been new strategy processes every year, where we've been rehashing the same conversations each annual planning. Many times I've found myself, I feel like stuck in the same conversation again and again, unable to really get to the heart of the matter because it wasn't the topic itself that was keeping us here and unresolved. There was something else going on underneath. And quite frankly, that was exhausting to me. I think as a strategist, you don't want to be doing strategy all the time. You want to kind of do it once and write it and move on. But what I found what was exhausting was I had to continually search for alignment. And that led to, not just for myself, but for the organizations or companies I work for, this kind of recurring restart, a refresh of a conversation or a re-engagement. Let's really get down to business kind of moments. And that was expensive. It was time consuming and over the years, often ineffective. So one of the things that I see by shifting the conversation from the topic of what to do and into the topic of what are the underlying needs we're trying to actually address, and also what are the dynamics that are kind of governing this system, this collective that we are in, is that you're trying to break that cycle. And that to me is one of the biggest implications of doing this kind of strategy process, is that it gave me the freedom to move forward. It was this sense of relief that I stopped having those conversations again and again and again, and finally, got to do the thing instead of talking about doing the thing. So just to recap, before we move into our breakout discussions, these are the 7 questions that I would encourage you to consider as you think about shifting your strategy process, right? Why, at the heart of it is why? How much time and effort and energy do you have? Are those with power ready to share power? Because as I know, some of us in this room may not be the CEO or the executive director, right, of our organization. And so even if we're bought into the vision, we need the center of power to be bought into the decision. How do you hold yourself accountable? And then really when designing your process, where are you starting from? And then also, what are the implications of making this shift? So let me pause there. And I think at this point, we're going to move into a set of discussion sections so that we can kind of take a time to reflect and absorb what we've heard today. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Sati and Tanveer. And now I officially stop the recording.